Welcome, everyone. My name is Jordan Dean. I'm the publicist for Neurologics, and I'm so happy to be the host today and welcome you all to Addiction, Relapse, and the Brain, presented by the founder and my friend, Karen Odell Barber, who's also an adolescent therapist. As I said, I am the publicist for Neurologics, and it's been such an honor to share some of the success stories that Neurologics has had with its clients. And we're so happy to have you here today to learn about its technology and how relapse does not have to be a part of the addiction journey. Thank you guys again for being here, as Neurologics is committed to doing a life transforming work for so many people and has already saved so many lives. With that introduction, I'd like to welcome the very best, Karen Odell Barber. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit them in the chat below, and we'll get those questions answered for you at the end of the webinar. Be also sure to check out some of those success stories that I was telling you about on the Neurologics website. There's been a ton of media about the technology and how it's changing people's lives. One especially is Julia, who had relapse over and over again. And it wasn't until she went through the optimization program that she didn't relapse anymore. And she's been 7 years sober. She's just one of thousands of stories from Neurologics. So with that said, please welcome Karen Odell Barber.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jordan. I'm Karen. This is a journey into brains that was unanticipated. I've always been drawn to very difficult cases. I did my postgraduate work in addiction at Berkeley and in eating disorders at Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford. And I always, as an early clinician, early in my career, was drawn to the difficult cases. And back in the day, those were real physical charts. And the ones that nobody wanted to sign up for, those were the ones that were appealing to me. And I've always felt like behavioral medicine is the stepchild of traditional Western medicine. We don't use imaging as much as we should. And I had looked for a tool like this all of my professional life when I stumbled across the technology that powers Neurologics 15 years ago. The first slide says the human brain is the most complicated structure in the known universe. We've only just scratched the surface in understanding how it works. And the next slide says Neurologics has unlocked the brain. With that, we say, and we have said for many years, that addiction is brain-based. And those are empty words that haven't been adopted in a mainstream way by the addiction treatment industry yet. And when I first started talking about brains 15 years ago, people looked at me like I was talking about Star Wars. But addiction lives in the brain. It's that yellow area on the slide called the cingulate gyrus. And an open cingulate, which is pictured here, looks kind of like a U shape. And the assumption would be that, hey, if somebody has addiction, we ask them to first get sober, we ask them to learn new tools and coping strategies, and then we ask them to retrieve those new coping tools and strategies from a toolbox in the time where they are in danger of relapse. If the cingulate is locked and you look at that yellowed area, it functions like an O, not a U. And so that area outside of the cingulate is the portion of the brain that's tasked with decision making, that's tasked with memory, that's tasked with looking outside of itself and looking for, okay, what was that tool? Call my sponsor. What was that? Oh gosh, that was a relapse trigger. I should get more sleep. I should work out. I should practice self-care. I should call my sponsor. I should go to a meeting. All of those things can happen if somebody's cingulate is unlocked like it's portrayed in this photo. But the part that's important is that OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, lives in the same part of the brain as addiction. And when somebody has a locked cingulate, it functions like an O, and that O is a hamster wheel. So if you think about all these tasks that we've just explained, the person with a locked cingulate thinks, I have a craving, I have an urge to use, I where can I get the drugs? How am I going to use? And they start putting into play with an obsessive rumination, how is it that they can put into play the, how can they go from urge to use in the quickest, portion of time? And so the difference between unlocked cingulate, which is the assumptive, right? We assume people can learn new tools, get sober, retrieve the tool from the toolbox, implement the tool at the right time. But if someone has a locked cingulate, that's not possible for them. Next slide, please. We know that addiction is genetic and linear. And what that means is that you're born with blue eyes, brown eyes, and you're born with the addiction signature, the gene, or not. And the gene has to be activated. So for example, a child of 2 alcoholic parents that's born with the gene that doesn't activate the gene may not, develop linear addiction because they haven't activated the gene. What does linear mean? It means it gets worse over time, and it follows a straight path. And if it's untreated, addiction is a fatal disease. Addiction comes in many forms, and it doesn't matter how the addiction presents itself. And what that means is addiction can be substance use, addiction can be pathologic gambling, addiction can be in the form of shopping, addiction can be use of pornography, addiction can be process addiction, use of devices. There are many different forms. They all live in the same part of the brain, and addiction is addiction is addiction. Next slide. Why traditional treatment isn't enough. We, for many, many years, have believed that recidivism and relapse were part of the journey. In fact, as a young therapist, I used to ruffle a lot of feathers when tried and true 12-step meeting facilitators would say, Karen, you need to understand that that relapse is part of the disease. And I would provocatively say, I don't believe anything good happens in relapse. And, their heads would kind of snap backward. And that was, sort of not a popular thing to be saying in the early to mid 90s. When the opioid crisis took off, it suddenly became very clear that in relapse, we were losing thousands and thousands and thousands of lives. And suddenly the addiction community began to rally around the idea that perhaps a more straightforward path without relapse would be something that was valued by the community. It doesn't have to be the case that relapse is part of the disease. And I have 2 mantras. One is nothing good happens in jail. And the second is you can get sober and people do recover. The outcome numbers for addiction have been largely unchanged, and those are not acceptable. We can do better, and everything starts with the brain. Behavioral medicine, behavioral healthcare treatment needs to use modern imaging, just like any other medical discipline. You would never, for example, say, I'm guessing that your bone is broken, and I'm guessing that what the treatment modality most helpful to you is putting screws in this broken bone that we're not sure whether it's broken or not. We're not sure where it's broken. Nobody would sign up for that. Nobody would say, yes, I'm going to allow you to perform surgery without a treatment plan and some imaging that guides that treatment process. And behavioral medicine is not different than any other form of traditional medicine, traditional Western medicine. Brain mapping should be part of a thorough assessment, and using that data to optimize cognitive function through neuroengineering changes learning and behavioral outcomes. This is the pathetic, 60 to 80% of people who seek treatment fail in their quest for sobriety. Those are the numbers. And so how does that impact family dynamics? I, with regularity, talk to families who say, my loved one's gone to treatment 4 times, I'm just done. Or does rehab even work? Or, hey, doesn't the person have to want to get sober? I would tell you the person has to have 10% willingness. And I would say that, regardless of age, gender, it doesn't matter. If somebody's 10% willingness to change their life, With good imaging and a treatment plan and the right treatment plan, people can get sober and have sustained sobriety right out of the gate. And then you can see kind of it is a vicious cycle between habit breaking abilities and good intentions, and robust and resilient cognitive function is much stronger than the idea that addiction is somehow a moral failure. And although we say, hey, addiction is brain-based, we treat it like this is a moral failing or a personality disorder, or we don't integrate brain function and the triggers for relapse on a brain functional level into traditional treatment. Next slide, please. If you think about behavioral medicine as an iceberg, and you think about clinicians who point at the things above the waterline and call them a label, that's what we're trained to do. And so if you think about above the waterline, we are pointing at things and saying, this person has, and we're applying a label so that we can speak to each other about known symptom clusters. If you think about what happens during Neurologics brain mapping, we look at the root causes underneath the iceberg that are causing the label. And so we're looking for things like the genetic addiction signature. We're looking at the IQ under stress. We're looking at root causes that under the waterline are producing the symptoms that we as clinicians are pointing at and calling names to. It's a huge paradigm shift to look at what is it that's causing this label, and to fix what's underneath the waterline takes the label away. I would tell you the brain is the foundation for everything. And I like this graphic because I would say that if you're building a house, it stands to reason that you wouldn't put all of this framework into the dirt without a foundation. You would put concrete in, you would wait for the concrete to harden, and then you would build your house because you can't live on concrete. That's the same analogy where addiction treatment is the frame. And in no way am I saying that Neurologics replaces addiction treatment. It does not. But what I'm saying is if it is added to as an adjunctive, if it is part of the relapse prevention program, if it is part of the assessment, if it is part of the treatment, the brain is the foundation for everything. And it also creates a foundation for success. If you can remember all of the amazing tools that you get in treatment, if you can remember to call your sponsor, if you are not so impulsive that you go straight from thought to action, which is what somebody with a really heated up cingulate does, you have a foundation for success. For Neurologics, everything starts with a brain map. What does that mean? It means that it's a 2-hour process. It utilizes FDA registered equipment, QEEG. It maps over 12,000 domains of brain function, and those provide metrics for clinical insight. After that, there's an optimization process that is called neuroengineering. It's a cognitive rehabilitation training tool, and it has a brain-computer interface as well as a live coach on the other side. It's informed by the brain map and customized to every single human's brain. It's not protocol driven. My brain doesn't look like your brain, doesn't look like the next person's brain. Every single brain is unique and individual, and every single optimization process is customized to that brain map. We also have the largest abnormal brain database in the world. And there is analysis that is shared with 2 other databases in a redacted form. Those are NIH and NYU. And for example, this is an element of interpretation from the database analysis. So the data gets uploaded. It's a 2-hour process of brain mapping. And what that means, what does mapping mean? It doesn't mean looking at the brain at rest. And that's what other forms of imaging do. They look at the structure of the brain. They don't look at the function of the brain as it's actually thinking. And that is the difference. That's what we do. So what is done over a 2-hour process is elements of psychometric testing, paper instrument testing, while wearing a cap while looking at the brain as it functions in a neuroelectric way. And so if you think about what is the structure of the brain versus function of the brain mean, it means if you're looking at the structure, you're looking at vessels, you're looking at how the brain is formed, you're looking at whether or not there has been a brain bleed. And so, for example, if you say, oh, let's get an MRI, that is a structural mapping tool. That is a structural tool. The difference is that we are looking at the brain as it thinks, and then there is an algorithm that puts the brain under task and under stress. And so, for example, there is a comparison between how the brain thinks in a perfect learning environment. And so, for example, if you think about taking a major test like an ACT test or an SAT test or the bar exam, and you think about like what are those rooms like, they're generally pretty temperate, they're temperature controlled, they're generally quiet, and they're generally pretty orderly. And how does the brain function in an optimal learning environment is one part of the mapping process. And then what does that brain look like when, I like to give the analysis or the analogy of I'm driving down the 405 freeway. I've got a rescue dog in the front seat that just threw up on the floor, and I've got 3 rowdy teenagers in the back seat. How does my brain functioning under that kind of stress in traffic on the 405? It's not going to function in the same optimal way that it functions when I am in the perfect learning environment. And it is the default between those numbers that's important in terms of treatment planning. The idea would be that with somebody with a functional, well-optimized brain, there would be maybe one standard deviation between that top number and the bottom number. So for example, if I am a bright person and I have an IQ of 120 and I default to 110, or even anything above 100, which is normal, I'm still in a pretty good place to be able to make sound decisions and be able to utilize my brain in a higher order thought way. If, however, I am that same person who has giftedness, but now I drop 4 standard deviations or 3 standard deviations, which is what we see routinely. Now I'm making decisions below 100, and I'm even getting into that place where I'm making decisions at 80, and 80 is the government standard for cognitive impairment. And so here I am with my big brain and my big capability, my big capacity. And over the years, I've heard parents say countless times, my kid is smart, my kid is capable. Why are they making these bad decisions? Addiction's not a bad decision. It's brain-based, right? And so the idea of expecting someone with addiction to be able to use their big brain and use the tools that they've been given or provided or, parental insight or any of these things, they're just not capable in times of stress of being able to use that top number IQ. You can see regulation ability. Emotional dysregulation is one of the cornerstones of addiction. And so the idea of, and you hear people say, oh, that person's very dysregulated, as though that is like a feeling or being state. That is a brain-based state. The idea of, and this is, this analysis comes from 2 databases and our own. So it comes from NIH, NYU, and ours. And the idea of, what are the possible symptoms that are checked? Those check boxes come straight from brain activity, not from any questionnaire, and not from, not from the client interview, the parent interview. It's just hard data, and making decisions from hard data is preferred to align a treatment team or align the patient and the family of origin or align the patient and the guarantor. It's just easy to get around hard science where over and over again, a child or a young adult will say, they'll always find somebody who thinks they don't have addiction. So they'll say, I know my mom thinks I've got addiction, but my dad doesn't. Or, hey, I know both my parents think I've got addiction, but my grandma doesn't, or my Uncle Joe doesn't. It's very helpful to be able to say, okay, we're listening to all of those things. Now let's just see what your brain says. This is a hard science tool, which provides this is scratching the surface of what the report looks like. It's now about 10 pages long. When I first looked at the tool, it was 38 pages long in 8-point mouse type that wasn't useful for anyone. I spent the first year and a half making it something that was of value in a multidisciplinary way to both clinicians, physicians, treatment teams, educators, educational attorneys, the client themselves, and the family system. Next slide, please. Prior brain injuries are often missed with clients in substance abuse treatment. This, for me, was profound. 20 to 28% of all substance abuse clients also have a history of prior brain injury. And that means, and prior brain injury means traumatic brain injury that shows up on imaging. We don't know why that is. We don't know if it's chicken and egg. We just know that it's there. And so if you think about, 20 to 28% is a large number. And so, for example, when, we're looking at someone with addiction and the parents are telling me their story and I'm doing a developmental timeline review, the first thing I think about is traumatic brain injury. The first thing I think about is that co-occurring previous brain injury that would explain kind of how we got to the arc of linear addiction. You cannot see traumatic brain injury on an MRI or a CT scan. It's also not observable on neuropsych testing, and neuropsych testing is paper instrument testing. This is another example of how foundational brain repair is critical to lasting recovery, because if we can, and we do, look at, here's where the brain is injured, and we can repair that brain injury, it restores the function to that part
Jody
of the brain
Womack
that's not
joined the meeting.
being used. Next slide, please. Substance abuse equals brain damage. That is provocative, but absolutely true. So if a client has used substances, that absolutely, substances are neurotoxic. And so what does that mean? In another talk that we're doing later this year, we talk about the results and the impact of wax marijuana use. There are all sorts of fallacies of, my kid just gets high and that's legal. Or, hey, does alcohol really cause brain damage? Or, hey, does opioid use cause brain damage? Or the idea that the brain is damaged by neurotoxins to the brain is demonstrable on imaging. And so the idea of, hey, if you are in treatment, just by the very act of you being in treatment, you have brain damage, right? And so previously, this was something that people in early recovery right out of detox really struggled with. And it was the idea of, sorry, I have brain damage, ergo, I've damaged my brain forever, and there's nothing at all that I can do about it. That's actually not true. Next slide. Optimization opens new neural pathways and new neural connections. And so if you think about, kind of in its easiest form, the easiest thing we do at Neurologics is traumatic brain injury. The most difficult thing we do at Neurologics is pediatric autism. And somewhere in the middle is addiction. And often addiction and attentional difference go hand in hand. I can't tell you the number of times that we look at someone with addiction and they also have ADHD. They also have traumatic brain injury, and they also have substance use damage, neurotoxic damage from the actual time and period of use. So how do you fix that? When you have a concussion, and I'll use that because it's the easiest example and it's pictured here. It's a black hole in your brain. And if you think about energy not traveling across a black hole, it never travels across that black hole ever again. And if you think about opening new neural pathways, those are spider webs around the black hole. You're opening new legs around the black hole so that that new neural pathway can do the work of the portion of the brain that's been damaged. And so if you look on the left without concussion, and you look on the right with concussion, you can see the damage from in a very observable way. And so optimization training, which is a cognitive rehabilitation program, is based upon the idea of neuroplasticity. And in our lifetime, that is a new concept, meaning that when my grandmother had a stroke, the idea was, oh my gosh, my grandmother has had a stroke. She's never going to be able to regain, that use of her face, the use of that portion of her tongue, the use of, the appendage that was damaged, the left arm. And we now know absolutely that people who've had stroke absolutely can regain use of and improve through a cognitive rehabilitation program. They can regain neural function. And it is that concept of neuroplasticity that drove the development of Neurologics. It is not a new technology. It's 25 years ago. I brought it into the mainstream 15 years ago. And so if you think about the regeneration of new neural pathways through new connections, they surround the location of the damage, and that is the resulting increase in brain function. So how do we do that? Next slide. First, there's a brain map. This is an Olympic athlete who's pictured, multi-sport Olympian. First, there's a brain map. Takes 2 hours. It's baseline brain map. It's an in-person session. What does that mean? It means that a mapper and the person being mapped are in the same room. It does not mean that you have to fly to one of our Neurologics assessment centers. We became virtual 5 years before COVID. And so what that means is that our mappers go to wherever the need is, and wherever the need is currently is in 48 US states. So if you live in Alaska or Hawaii, we ask you to come to our Newport Beach location. Other than that, the other 48 states are visited by a brain mapper. We figured out quickly from our clients' feedback that bringing a severely autistic child on a plane, or someone who is already pretty dysregulated on a commercial flight, can be both daunting and limiting. And when the equipment became mobile, so did the brain mapping process. The second portion is the results analysis, and that's what we talked about. There is a 1 hour telephonic report of findings, and that is divided into 30-minute segments. So what does that mean? It means if you are ordering a map for your client, if you're a clinician and you say, look, I'd like you to get a Neurologics brain map, the client would sign a release, and you would be able to have a consultation for 30 minutes with one of our doctors to get the report of findings with or without the client present, depending on what the issues are. Sometimes parents of an adolescent want the information first, and we recommend that when they're making treatment decisions. So if the person is adolescent or a child, the 30-minute consult with our physicians takes place without the child present. There is always an offer of the treatment team and the identified patient, the child, the adolescent, the young adult. We see people from 5 years old to 85 years old to hear the results analysis directly from the providers. And we just divide them into 30-minute, very easily chunked pieces of information. The next process is a neuroengineering process. And that means there are 3 1-hour sessions per week for a period of 2 months. Those take place can take place anywhere in the world, doesn't have to even be domestic. We ship equipment. There are leads in a very specific instruction process. And there's also a human being that is an accountability coach. They're a neuroengineering coach. And if you think about the process as this is a trainer for your brain, like going to the gym. I'm much more likely to show up for an appointment if I know that someone's waiting there for me than if it's left to my own devices and I can work out any time between 7 a.m. and 11 p.m., but I don't because I'm not accountable to a specific appointment time. We have, over the last 15 years, determined that it is very helpful to have that accountability and to have that human connection. And yes, we are a technology company with a medical vertical, but it is the human element that keeps our clients engaged. Wherever possible, they have the same neuroengineering coach throughout. And after 2 months, we do a midpoint mapping progress check. That's number 4. We remap, and then we measure the progress back against the initial map, number 1. That means then that we fine tune the next 2 months of optimization. There, again, 3 1-hour sessions per week for 2 months. And then there is a final mapping that is a proof of results, meaning, hey, how has the brain moved, improved, changed in the process of neuroplasticity? There is a report card. There are maps every 2 months. And what that has meant for people with addiction is that in saying nothing's working, I'm not feeling successful, I feel like nothing has changed. There is an efficacy in the fact that we can't magically wave a wand and give them the results without their own agency and effort. And so it's the idea of, if you go to the gym, no one's lifting the barbell for you. You have to lift it for yourself. And the idea of the coach being able to, in early recovery, organize and order the cognitive rehabilitation exercises so that the client can be successful is helpful. Meaning, if they are frustrated, if they can't complete exercises, there is a, in early recovery, there is an irritability and a frustration tolerance problem. And the coaches are specifically trained to be able to organize the exercises and be able to get the client through the sessions in the most productive way. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm totally hacking up a lung and I apologize. If you look at the results with substance abuse clients, they speak for themselves and they turn the paradigm totally upside down. 89% of Neurologics clients who've done optimization and residential treatment are sober at the 18-month mark. Traditional treatment, only 24% of clients are sober at the 18-month mark. We have seen more than 21,000 clients overall. This was a large study of 150 addiction clients, and you can see what the results are in bar graph form. There's an 18-point increase in IQ. That is permanent. That's one of the byproducts of Neurologics optimization, is a 15 to 18-point bump in permanent functional IQ. I was once at the Meadows in Malibu, and the medical director, made a joke and said, please stand up or raise your hand if you can't use 18 functional IQ points. 18 functional IQ points is the difference between vocational school and college. It's the difference between college and graduate school. 18 functional IQ point improvement to brain function enables somebody to make different decisions. It enables them to be able to learn new things. There is a 19-point bump in thinking ability and a 27-point bump in learning ability. In the beginning of the talk, we talked about the locked cingulate gyrus is where addiction resides in the brain. And we talked about the expectation that people with addiction will be able to, from learned experience, take the new tool that they learned in treatment and pull it out of the toolbox at the right time. Without optimization, the ability to recall that with a locked cingulate gyrus is next to impossible. With optimization, there's a 42-point bump in recall. If you can recall and remember the amazing things that people learn in treatment and pull that tool out of the toolbox at the right time, now we're cooking with gas. And if you also look at the ability to regulate emotions, there's a 60-point bump in self-control, 43 in compulsivity, being present, attention, and impulsivity. The numbers speak for themselves. This is in our peer-reviewed literature. It appears in medical open access journals that were published by Neurologics. Next slide, please. The twice published in peer-reviewed applications of the technology, demonstrate the efficacy and consistency of results. Our outcomes are unmatched against any other technology or service available. My Western trained physician husband 15 years ago, when I, happened upon this technology, said, "Is it peer reviewed?" And again, Western trained medicine, if it's not in the peer reviewed literature, it doesn't exist. Jordan, who so kindly introduced me in the beginning of this presentation, has been instrumental in after peer review. We've been on, multiple network news stories in various different markets. And that was, again, based on the media checkbox of, is it a story? Is it something we're willing to talk about? Is it science we're willing to accept only if it's peer reviewed? We're peer reviewed in addiction and also in traumatic brain injury. Next slide. Oh, looks like I finished 4 minutes early, so write that down. I'm never early. I don't know if there are questions in the chat box, but I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. And I don't know if it was explained that questions can go into the chat box, Cody. I don't know if we have questions in the chat box. But also, if you unmute it, I'm happy to answer questions. And there's no such thing as a bad question. We developed something at Neurologics called Coffee and Connections. And it's just a chance for clinicians to come and ask questions about brains. And believe me, there's no such thing as a bad question. We're in the age of the brain now, but it's not something any of us learned in grad school. And so if you have questions here, I'm happy to answer them. If you want to contact our admissions team, our gift for your attendance in this webinar is we'd like to give you $500 in gift card for your personal use, for your client use, for your child use. It doesn't matter. We're grateful for your time. And our admissions team, if you don't feel comfortable asking questions in this format, would be so happy to answer those questions individually.
Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat, but something we do get asked a lot, Karen, maybe you can elaborate on, is how we work with or how we help for some of the co-occurring conditions that go along with substance abuse, like anxiety and depression, things like that.
Sure. That's a great question, Cody. Thank you. So the brain is the brain, right? And if you go back to the iceberg slide, if you don't mind clicking back to it, Cody, I think that'd be helpful. I think that no matter what you look for, the map will tell you everything. So the idea of, I was that good, obedient clinician in the beginning for the first year and a half, and I would say, does this work with anxiety? How about bipolar disorder? How about an eating disorder? How about, and I would come up with every possible label I could think of. And it was the technology developer who drew on a whiteboard this very rudimentary iceberg, and it didn't look like this. It wasn't fancy, and he was pretty exasperated at the time and said, like, Karen, it doesn't matter. The brain is the brain is the brain. It doesn't know how it gets injured. It doesn't know the label that you're applying. The brain doesn't know that it has that label. And the brain, like other organs, wants to repair itself. And so if you think about liver damage and liver repair, and you think about cirrhosis of the liver desperately wants to, after the toxins are removed, it wants to restore and repair itself. The brain does too, but it needs very specific guidance as to what portions of the brain have been injured, because it doesn't know. And so the idea of, does somebody have anxiety? Does somebody have depression? Those are byproducts. And the idea of in a treatment, in a neurologics treatment protocol, every single portion of the brain is analyzed. And the parts of the brain that are overperforming, underperforming, we have lots of clients who have giftedness genetically, but they're not meeting their academic potential, for example. And those people could report things like anxiety and depression. The idea is that once the brain becomes fully optimized and they, function in a different way, those symptoms of anxiety and depression are reduced. We certainly have seen over 15 years a tremendous number of clients be able to reduce or get off psychotropic medication. I'm sorry, psychiatric medication. The idea of an improved brain equals, improved brain function equals, we've even had people with cognitive decline become much more sensitive to their medical needs. We've had people, lose weight, improve their cardiac function because suddenly the brain, which is the driver of the body, is cared for and functioning. And suddenly they can and do listen to and attend to things that, their primary physicians have told them about, you got to lose some weight. Hey, you're pre-diabetic. Hey, your cholesterol is terrible. We have seen how brain and body work together. The brain is the driver. It's the hard drive of the computer, right? And the brain is actually the interface with the outside world. And the idea of, the label dependent diagnosis is how we function in an insurance billing way. So the idea of, hey, this is a 49-year-old polysubstance abuser with anxiety, with depression, with this personality disorder on axis 2. That has been what has been required to get insurance to pay for treatment. It is not helpful to the person with the label applied. And once what's fixed underneath the water, once the waterline root cause is fixed, the symptoms that you're seeing that you're fitting into a neat box aren't there anymore. Other questions? I saw one in the chat box.
Hi, Karen. I think I had one question. It was just a little long. I didn't know if I could type it out. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. And I appreciated learning how the cingulate gyrus is where addiction lives in the brain. And then you mentioned like when it's locked, that's what makes it difficult for clients to use coping skills that they're being given or any tools that they have. And
that's right.
And you mentioned when it gets locked, is that due to like a gene, or like you said something about like the gene portion? I think that's where I got a little lost. I wanted to.
So a locked cingulate is an overactive cingulate. So if you think about the brain in terms of neuroelectric activity, and you think about like part of the brain's working too hard or it's overactive, right? Mm-hmm. And if the cingulate is overactive, the idea is that cingulate is locked. And it's sort of like if you think about a generator that's running too hard, and you're like, this thing's going to blow up. And what in the world's going on? I'm listening to this thing and it sounds so faulty, it's going to blow up. That's the analysis that's the analogy I would use. And I would say the gene is you have a genetic propensity for addiction, and there's nothing at all that you can do about that. It's just, hey, who are your ancestors and did it get passed on? That's it, right? And so the idea of like addiction's genetic and linear, if you want to go back to that slide, Cody, the idea of you're born with blue eyes, you're born with brown eyes, you're born with the addiction signature, or you're not. And so if you are a person who is not born with the addiction signature, you can drink casually. You can say, I'm going to have a couple of drinks, or, hey, I don't feel like drinking tonight at all because I got to be up at 7:00 in the morning tomorrow. Or you can say, drinking today is probably not a good coping skill for me because I just got some bad news and alcohol is a depressant. Someone without the addiction signature can modulate use in all forms. And that could be use of, anything. We talked about process addiction, use of devices, use of pornography, use of, online gambling, use of pathologic spending. All of those things, if you don't have the gene, are different than somebody who has the gene and has activated the gene. And when we talk about addiction comes in many forms, we also talk about cross addiction. And people who are in the addiction treatment world say, okay, this person is now sober from alcohol and they now have process addiction, or they are now sober from use of opioids, and now they've developed sex and love addiction. There are cross addictions, and they all live in the brain. And addiction is addiction, right? And so how it presents itself can morph and change over time. But it is that locked cingulate in the brain. If you want to go back to that slide, Cody, it is that locked cingulate in the brain that is, this is an unlocked cingulate, right? And it's U-shaped. And just to review again, it was profound when nobody teaches you this stuff in graduate school. So it was like, addiction lives in the cingulate gyrus. And I go, oh God, it does. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's where OCD lives. Right. So the rumination, the inability to get out of your own way, the, hey, I've got to do the rituals, the, hey, let's try to break the rituals, the feeling compelled and controlled by the addiction. This is where OCD lives in the brain. So this is a normative cingulate pictured. So it's not overheated, it's not overacting. And what happens when you see the overactive cingulate on mapping is when that cingulate is locked, those yellow portions that at the bottom are the energy is traveling so rapidly. There's no ability to go outside and make decisions. There's no ability to say, oh gosh, I believe I'm in danger of relapse. I need to call my sponsor. Oh gosh, these are signs and symptoms of relapse. I don't want that because, hey, if I relapse, I'm going to break my sobriety contract with my family of origin. I'm going to lose my trust fund. I'm going to lose the ability to operate a motor vehicle. I'm going to lose the ability to see my kids. The whole issue is that addiction lives in this cingulate, and when it is locked, and you think about that big yellow, it's all connected. There's no gap in between. The energy transfer is so fired up that, hey, all you're thinking about is, I want to use, I'm going to use, how am I going to get drugs or whatever the drug of choice is, whether that's, process addiction, spending, gambling, whatever it is, the OCD element of addiction, which is right there in the part of the brain where OCD lives, is fueling and powering the decision-making process, right? And so the idea of, and there is no decision, like I'll just tell you that the idea of, oh, why does that person make poor choices? They're not making a choice. Their cingulate is so fired up that they're not able to make a choice, right? And they move from thought to action. So the idea of the expectation is that, okay, we're asking you to calm down, to take a breath, to think about choices, and to pull a tool out of the toolbox. If the cingulate gyrus is overactive, the ability to do that doesn't exist. It just doesn't. So the idea of, hey, addiction's a choice, and we assign all sorts of value judgment to, this person's not making good choices. It isn't a choice. The cingulate's super fired up, and unless it is not fired up, the ability to make choices is removed. So the whole, hey, you're not making good choices, which comes with a whole lot of judgment, right? And it actually, we're just not talking about apples and apples. The idea of, yes, this person pictured here has an unlocked cingulate gyrus. So yes, they have the ability to make choices. They have the ability to use tools. They have the ability to remember. But people with that locked, think about it as U versus O. If you're in a hamster wheel and you're running on the wheel, you go straight from thought to action. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much, Karen. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And it removes the value judgment. I mean, for me, what's helpful is, well, I think they can make choices. I think they just don't want to be sober. Okay, great. Let's take a look. Right. And the unequivocal nature of science is comforting. I would tell you, I'm a clinician who likes data. I went to the London School of Economics, and I'm one of those odd people who, I'm a healer who loves data. And I love to look at numbers and make decisions based upon guideposts, numbers, and science, and not just guess. Oh, I guess this might be a good thing for you to try. I'm guessing this might be a good thing for you to try. There's no guesswork. And again, just back to, my dad thinks I'm an addict. I'm not sure. My mom says I'm not an addict. Or my dad thinks I can drink socially. Again, hey, I'm imagining that I can drink socially again. Well, let's look at your brain and see if that's true. You do or do not have the addiction signature. You do or do not have the gene and it's been activated. Hey, guess what? In 20 to 28% of the cases, hey, guess what? There's damage to your brain here that's traumatic, that looks like traumatic brain injury. And so even though you answered, nope, there's no traumatic brain injury, let's look at the map here. It's right there. And then you'd be amazed. I mean, parents go, oh my God, Was that when we were tossing her in the pool and she hit the concrete coving because we missed and she hit the side? Yes, that could be that. Hey, is that, oh, whoops, it was moving day and she pulled a marble 4-poster bed down on top of her. Could that be it? Yes, it could be. But the imaging guides the conversation, because previously in the intake it is there a history of traumatic brain injury? No, there's not. Okay, no slips, no falls, no fall out of a high chair when you're small, a small child or a stroller, no dropped from a height, no stumbling during early walking, no falls down the stairs, no, and I mean, I go into a copious amount of detail, but if there is traumatic brain injury and addiction, go back to the slide, please, Cody, go hand in hand. And the idea of like, okay, let's take a look and let's get a map and let's look at, first of all, let's rule out the very likely companion, which is TBI. 20 to 28% of people who are diagnosed with the diagnosis of substance use disorder also have traumatic brain injury. And that, again, we don't know why. And we don't know if it's chicken or egg. We don't know if they used and were and blacked out and didn't recall it. We don't know if they had an unsteady gait and fell during a time of use. We don't know a lot, but what we do know is that those two things strongly correlate. And the first thing I would think of in any person with substance use disorder is, do they also have traumatic brain injury? And the only way of finding that out, you're not going to find it on an MRI. And you're not going to find it in psych testing, but you will see it. You will see the imaging pattern on a Neurologics brain map. Other questions?
Mm. All right.
Okay.
Well, if there are any further questions after this presentation that may pop up, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help. And thank you all for your time. And hopefully you will be working with Neurologics to help your clients live their best lives possible. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, guys.